The Washington Declaration aims to allay anxiety over Pyongyang's nuclear weapons ambitions by establishing a consultative body intended to give Seoul more say in how the US and South Korea counter threats by North Korea. So what are the implications of this declaration on regional tensions? How does the Washington Declaration compare to the nuclear deal between the US and NATO? And what are now some of the diplomatic tasks ahead for the Yoon administration? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we take a look at the diplomatic advancements made during President Yoon Suk-yeol's state visit to the US last week. For this, I have Professor Kim Hyun-wook from the Korea National Diplomatic Academy here in the studio. Professor Kim, welcome.
Thank you for having me here.
I also have Dr. Stephen Nerpa at Asia Dialogue Live on the line over in Honolulu. Dr. Nerpa, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. A pleasure to be back.
Right. Professor Kim, let's start off then with your overall assessment of the latest Yoon-Biden summit.
Well, I think his singing American Pie was very impressive. I heard that he is a very good singer, and I think he has very strong point in his kinship diplomacy, I think. Overall, I think this meeting was very meaningful because during the past 10 years, South Korean government's policy was skewed towards China. Leaning toward China and also trying to be balanced between the U.S. and China. That gave a wrong signal to the United States about the position of South Korea. And now the U.S.'s Indo-Pacific strategy is now going on, but I think until now the pivotal allies in this region, from my perspective, seems like Japan and Australia, not South Korea. So I think we are obliged to, we have an obligation to restore the alliance back to previous solid conditions. And in that sense, I think this was a very important momentum for the alliance.
Right. And Dr. Nerpa, what is your take with regard to the latest summit between Presidents Yoon and Biden?
Well, I would agree with Professor Kim that it's important, especially on the 70th anniversary of the alliance. There was much to say, much to celebrate, but also it's an important time, as Secretary of State Blinken said in the segment that you broadcast earlier. Korea is recognized by the United States as a, quote, pivotal global player. And that means it's important for the United States and South Korea to be on the same page relative to concerns about the DPRK, relative to other regional developments to include China, the Taiwan issue, and of course, Ukraine. So to consider this meeting in the context not only of the U.S.-Korea bilateral, but also the upcoming meeting with Japan and also the G7 meeting. So it shows a rather heady steam for South Korean diplomacy now.
Right, indeed. Professor Kim, let's now turn our attention to the Washington Declaration. First then, what are the implications of this particular declaration on regional tensions, do you think?
I think the creation of nuclear consultative group was the key issue in the Washington Declaration. After the Ukraine war, in Asia, which is different from NATO, allies like Japan and Korea began to doubt the credibility of U.S. extended terms to allies. I mean, NATO countries got together strongly to cope with Russia, but it didn't happen in Asia. And South Korea too. Last year, the North Korea began to test its new missiles and also nuclear warhead-tapped missile tests happened last year and early this year, and South Korean people began to feel insecure. Public poll says that almost more than 75% of South Korean people answered that we need our own nuclear weapons. So I think in that sense, this was very meaningful because before the United States did not share anything with South Korea about the U.S. nuclear operations in the Korean Peninsula. I mean, the Strategic Command did not share anything with the South Korean government. And I think it's meaningful that throughout the nuclear consultative group, finally, two countries began to talk with each other, discuss with each other about what to do about the U.S. nuclear weapons in the Korean Peninsula.
Right, and staying with this, Dr. Nepa, the Yoon administration has explained that the Washington Declaration will make South Koreans feel like they're sharing nuclear weapons with the U.S. But the Biden administration, for its part, has denied that the declaration is a form of de facto nuclear sharing. How do you explain this discrepancy in interpretation of the Washington Declaration?
Well, they're different interpretations, but they're not necessarily discrepancy, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. If it makes South Koreans feel more secure, that is certainly a good thing. And the United States has very strict protocols about the control of its nuclear weaponry, and that's not going to change. But what is going to change with this new consultative mechanism is that there will be the introduction of a process. And the process implies more information sharing, more coordination, more understanding of those nuclear protocols, and that's incredibly important. Couple that with economic security concerns and the need to address those better, and that comes out to be a win-win for both Korea and the United States.
And staying with that, Professor Kim, under the Washington Declaration, the plan is to form a nuclear consultative group. What more can you tell us about this particular group and Seoul's potential role in it?
As I have mentioned briefly, last year, South Korea and the United States went into a series of processes of how to bolster the U.S. extension to South Korea. And last November at the SCM meeting, which is Security Consultative Meeting between two defense ministers of South Korea and the United States, the agreement came out that the two countries will strengthen their discussions on information sharing, strategic planning, and processes of discussions, and finally execution, which is military exercises. So I think at this time, nuclear consultative group is something that they finally began to institutionalize some of the arena that they can really discuss these issues. The role of Seoul is very solid, which is different from the NATO's nuclear planning group. It's a multilateral group. 30 countries participate in the NATO's nuclear planning group. And I think the only key countries that participate actively in the nuclear planning, strategic planning in NATO is US and England. Other countries just follow the decisions made by them. So, but in contrast, this is bilateral group. Nuclear consultative group is bilateral. US and South Korea are the only players in it. We have no other way but to participate and voice our opinions about the U.S. Nuclear operations. So I think even though we don't have U.S. Tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea, I would say the consultation mechanism is much stronger than NATO's nuclear planning group.
Right, and keeping in mind what Professor Kim has just said, Dr. Nepa, what more can you tell us about the difference between the nuclear consultative group and the nuclear planning group that Washington shares with NATO?
Sure. Well, they're quite different, and I wouldn't overplay those differences anything of concern for Korea. The NATO one is bound by more of a common agenda, especially in light of Russia's aggression. We need to remember that there are three nuclear powers, the United States, the UK, and France involved. It is twice-a-year meeting with defense ministers, and so it is a more formalized mechanism. This is a step forward between South Korea and the United States to create a mutual understanding and to share information. So it's not truly a formalized process, at least not yet. And it's most likely that Japan will be brought into the process in a trilateral type of arrangement. So in terms of creating a foundation for regional structures in Northeast Asia, this could be the beginning of enhanced communications and a more effective dialogue mechanism. At least that's the aspiration.
Right. And moving forward, Professor Kim, Presidents Yoon and Biden have agreed to broaden their alliance to promote peace and prosperity beyond the Korean Peninsula. How do you respond to this perhaps ambitious joint endeavor?
The alliance has been transformed into comprehensive strategic alliance in the year 2009. But it has not been really well implemented because of China, the rise of China. South Korea was pretty much, passive in dealing with regional alliance activities because South Korea was thinking that maybe China can do some kind of important role economically and also in denuclearizing North Korea. But I think this time two countries are kind of stepping further in dealing with regional issues. One important issue, I think, is Taiwan Strait issues. I mean, they did not say Taiwan Strait, but at the statement, two countries stipulated that they do not they oppose the changes of status quo in the Indo-Pacific area. I think that includes the Taiwan Strait area. But this is very important for South Korea. It's not just an issue that sidelines with the United States and hassles with China, but it is an important issue for the security of South Korea. Because if something happens in Taiwan Strait, if some sort of military conflicts happens between the U.S. and China, that doesn't happen only in the Taiwan Strait area. That is something that is enlarged into the entire regions. Japanese and South Korean military have to be embroiled, even though we don't want it, because U.S. forces in Japan and South Korea will be targets of Chinese military attack. So I think, having said that, I think the South Korean position should be that we do not like any kind of changes in the status quo of this Taiwan Strait, because that is something that if affects the security situations in the Korean Peninsula negatively.
And staying with that, Professor Kim, how does Seoul's growing alliance with Washington look to affect perhaps its future ties with neighboring Beijing?
Now the situation is totally different from the past. I mean, during the Obama government, Obama wanted to have a very good cooperative relationship with China, calling it as G2. Trump government also began to, bash China, but it did it, alone. It did not ask allies and partners to be on the side of the United States together to deal with China. But now Biden government is asking and requesting allies to be sidelining with the United States to bash China. So it's a zero-sum game. We have no other options but to be sidelining with the United States. I mean, before maybe being balanced between the U.S. and China was okay. I mean, we can guarantee our own diplomatic space between U.S. and China, but I don't think that is possible anymore. It's a zero-sum situations, and being in the middle is not an important option at this juncture.
Right. Dr. Nerpa, Washington reportedly briefed Beijing in advance about the Washington Declaration. What do you suppose are the implications of this particular reality?
Well, we've seen the implications, which are China has objected fairly strongly to the Washington Declaration. And I think we need to be very careful here, because as much as the United States and Korea appear to be in an alignment, and as good as the meeting may have come off for bilateral relations, there are some differences, and Korea needs to be careful not to overextend. The Americans need to be careful not to imply that for Korea, because China is its biggest neighbor and its biggest economic partner. It's also important relative to some of the economic differences between the United States and South Korea. And South Korea needs to stand strong on issues like chips and electric vehicles. And the United States, as an ally, should be willing to give more, and also appreciate the fact that South Korea is the largest single foreign direct investor in the United States since 2021. And so those investments in the U.S. and the jobs they've created in the United States are terribly important. That is not lost on China, to your question. And so China is concerned about the back and forth, about the growing economic relationship and cooperation between South Korea and the United States. And with this growing bloc mentality, China, Russia, and the DPRK seem to be allied and at a schism with the United States, South Korea, Japan, Australia, India, and their other partners.
Right, and Dr. Nerpa, this is an impromptu question, but we have had the Taiwanese foreign minister talk about a potential war breaking out in the Taiwan Strait in the year 2027. If that is the likely scenario in the future, what is a stance that perhaps South Korea could take up right now to kind of defuse that situation in the future? First of all, do you think there will be warfare in that region in the year 2027?
Well, I would like to think not. It's in a significant year, given the 100th anniversary for the PRC. But the issue really is, to what extent are those contingencies in place for South Korea, were that to happen? I think we have to be careful not to corner China. And what we need to be doing in the international arena is to encourage responsible Chinese leadership. And we're not really doing that right now. There has been this drift to point out the deficiencies, and those are real. There are many, many concerns, from technology to trade, intel, et cetera, human rights. But the fact of the matter is, people will have to do better to find ways to promote that responsible Chinese leadership if there's to be peaceful coexistence, if we're to avoid a conflict over Taiwan. And let us hope that China walks away with the message from Russia's aggression in Ukraine that the cost is very significant, both by way of sanctions and unanimity in the international arena, and what that would do for China, which has much greater economic interdependence and needs those international allies more than a much smaller Russian economy, and that economic cost for China should dissuade them from aggression in Taiwan. If that makes sense. And the economic bottom line is absolutely critical. But we need to be working and developing contingencies to prevent that, to prevent conflict, and to try to find ways to guarantee economic security, diversification of supply chains, and to protect the types of communications and economic nodes that are so vital for Taiwan as a partner and as a friend to South Korea and the United States.
Right, of course. Dr. Nerpa, U.S. President Joe Biden on several occasions applauded President Yoon Suk-yeol's efforts to better engage with his Japanese counterpart, Fumio Kishida. Do you agree that Washington has strategic interest in amiable ties between Seoul and Tokyo?
Oh, absolutely. Both Seoul and Tokyo represent Washington's closest allies in East Asia. And so they have long wanted to see the impasse of the last several years moved beyond. They would like to see warmer ties. And it seems that the intent of both the Yoon and the Kishida government is to do that. And so the meeting that takes place around May 7th, 8th, with Kishida's visit, a return visit relative to Yoon's visit in March, as well as the G7, which will take place in Japan. And so that sit down in Hiroshima will be very important. It's important for Korea's status to be there with the G7 nations. And so it's important as we move forward to have good coordination relative to DPRK concerns, especially the missile and nuclear development, relative to China, and relative to Russia's growing aggression over Ukraine. And so that community of nations, to include the United States, Korea, and Japan, incredibly important.
Right, and staying with what Dr. Nerpa has just said, Professor Kim, sources are saying that Prime Minister Fumio Kishida may visit Korea either on the 7th or 8th of this particular month. And that being said, what issues do you see topping the agenda? Do you see global affairs topping the agenda, including North Korea's nuclear weapons ambitions only, or do you also see historical differences between Seoul and Tokyo taking center stage as well?
Some Japanese media reports that maybe, Prime Minister Kishida would not talk about the historical issues much. I mean, that is not really a good issue for him to talk for domestic politics. So I think the major issue, to be talked is, security issues. Japanese government has been, keeping an eye on what happens at the Washington Declaration between the U.S. and South Korea, because that is also a very important issue for Japan. Because, Japan thinks that Taiwan contingency is Japan contingency, and they are also worrying about the U.S. nuclear umbrella in this reason. Of course, they don't want nuclear weapons to be deployed in the Japanese territory, but they think that there should be nuclear umbrella strengthened in this region, maybe deployed in Guam or somewhere, because they're worrying that the U.S. does not have any kinds of massive conventional weapons, or the U.S. does not have any non-strategic nuclear weapons in this region to deal with possible Chinese use of non-strategic nuclear weapons in the case of Taiwan Strait contingencies. So I think their Japanese government is very much interested in the extended deterrence measures. I think they will try to raise up these issues so that U.S., Japan, and Korea might talk about the extended deterrence issues more multilaterally or trilaterally, so that they can strengthen their security throughout those multilateral agenda.
Right. Professor Kim, broadly speaking, what are some of the future diplomatic assignments for the Yoon administration going forward?
Definitely, as I've mentioned, South Korean governments for now is to have a diplomatic strategic directions into the United States. So the homework is then what kinds of flexible policy actions we have to deal with China and Russia. That doesn't mean that we are balanced, but there should be more flexibility required to deal with China and Russia, so that the relationship would be still not damaged. The relationship with China and with Russia would not cross over the red line. I think that's something related to, for now, the South Korea's assistance to the Ukraine war. What level do we have to assist Ukraine so that we can, on one hand, contribute to the international norms, but at the same time would not really damage the relationship with Russia. I think that's the first assignment. A second one, I think, is pretty much economic issues. I mean, it seems like a Biden government is trying to bring many allies, companies and factories into the United States so that they can contribute to the U.S. supply chains. So then what happens to the economic interests of South Korea? I mean, ILA Act and Semiconductor Act, they are very harsh in their conditions to give some subsidies to foreign companies. So I think some companies like Samsung and TSMC and some other battery manufacturing and electric car manufacturing companies, for example, German companies, they have a hard time right now. It should be a win-win game, a win-win relationship, but it seems like it's pretty much leaning towards more towards a U.S. interest rather than other allies' interests. So how can we deal with those economic issues with the United States? I think that's a very fundamental homework for us.
And it's also a very daunting task ahead then. All right, Professor Kim, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today. And Dr. Nerpa over in Hawaii, thank you so much for your insights today.
Aloha, thank you.
Right, well, on that note, we end this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow. That is Tuesday.